Hi, my name is Meghan Magee. I'm very excited to be here tonight. I am a PhD student at George Mason University. My mentor is Dr. Margaret Jones, and we do our research out of the Patriot Performance Laboratory, which is located in the field house of the Fairfax campus of George Mason. So we are able to do a lot of our research within the athletes, and the athletics program is Division I. So it's very nice being able to do research with the Division I athlete population. I'm going to talk to you today about load monitoring. We do a pretty good deal of load monitoring in our lab, so I'm just going to talk about the different aspects of that. So what exactly is load monitoring? Well, it's a pretty comprehensive process that can be a little complex because of everything that goes into it. So we need to look at external loads, internal loads, wellness measures, and biomarkers. So the external loads that we look at in our athletes, we will look at sprint count, which would be the number of sprints that are occurring during a specific duration. So that could be something that you set. Say you want to look at how many times an athlete sprints within a 5-minute time frame, or it could be during an entire training session or throughout a whole competition. We can also look at collision count, and collision count is going to be the number of times that two athletes collide or get into contact with one another. This is a really popular metric used in football, of course. However, it is important in our other contact sports, such as basketball, lacrosse, and soccer. Player load is actually kind of from a equation that is developed through the software that you use to monitor load. So it's not an equation that we necessarily calculate. The software takes a bunch of things into consideration, such as sprint count, the collisions, repeated high intensity efforts, and total distance covered, as well as heart rate, and it will give you a value of player load based on all of that. We can also look at player load per minute, which is again calculated by the software that you use to monitor load. Our repeated high intensity efforts are going to be any high intensity activities such as acceleration, sprints, or collisions that are occurring very close together. This is going to be more common in our intermittent sports, intermittent team sports such as basketball, soccer, and lacrosse. And then an important measure that we look at here as well is total distance covered, which has been shown to be the strongest predictor of internal loads. So looking at internal loads, the first one that we look at is resting heart rate, and this can be very easily collected through wearing a heart rate monitor while you're sitting or laying down, or even on Fitbits, Apple Watches, Whoop watches, Oura rings, and stuff like that. Heart rate variability is a very important measure that we use, and it is the variability between successive heartbeats, so back-to-back heartbeats. And it is considered a non-invasive way to check the status of our cardiovascular branch of our autonomic nervous system. This can give us an indication of how ready an athlete is to perform. It can be done within 1 to 5 minutes, so it's pretty quick. And this, the waking measures, so when you first wake up in the morning and you put a heart rate monitor on, or you put your watch on for that 1 to 5 minutes to watch for your heart rate variability, they have been most correlated with performance. Typically, we would want to see a low heart rate variability. So the lower the heart rate variability, the more likely the athlete is ready to perform. We can also look at rating of perceived exertion. So that's just simply asking the athlete, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very easy, 10 being the hardest thing you've ever done, how difficult was that training session? How hard was this drill? How challenging was that game? And then the athlete can rate that. So that can be something that's very simply done on pen and paper, or you could even do it through different apps. We also measure blood lactate. So this would be where you would need a lactate analyzer. It's very quick to do and relatively painless. You just do a quick finger prick. You just need a little drop of blood, and then it tells us how much blood lactate is in the body at that time. Another metric that we look at is training impulse, or TRIMP, and this is going to take into account the training duration as well as the change in heart rate during that time. And then lastly, we look at neuromuscular fatigue, so how fatigued our muscles are getting. How we can measure this is by doing weekly counter movement jumps on a jump mat, so it's relatively easy to do. Or you could even do peak speeds as well and look at that as a weekly measure as well to see how fatigued an athlete is. Our wellness measures can be done through surveys and questionnaires. So they can be simple as asking an athlete's sleep quality, their mood, their satiety, how they think their nutrition is, how fatigued they are mentally and physically. So we can give them surveys and questionnaires to ask these questions to kind of gauge how they are feeling wellness-wise. And then lastly, we look at biomarkers. So popular biomarkers in load monitoring are cortisol, which is a stress hormone, C-reactive protein, which rises in response to inflammation. So exercise does cause an inflammatory response in the body. So when you do exercise, you would have a rise in C-reactive protein. We also look at creatine kinase, and this is an indicator of muscle damage in the body. And we look at vitamin D as well. Vitamin D is really critical for bone building. So when you are participating in sports that involve jumping, landing, quick changes of direction, and high speed accelerations, we would need the vitamin D to help us with our bone rebuilding. So that way we can make sure that we maintain strong, healthy bones. So that way we avoid the risk of injury. And then lastly, testosterone, which is a sex hormone, can actually change throughout a sports season in both men and women. So we can see levels of testosterone drop off or increase as the season goes on. We also measure body composition. So that's really important to take a look at as well to make sure the athlete is in as much the most optimal shape that we can have them in for their performance. So we can measure percent body fat, fat-free mass, as well as bone mineral density. The way we do it in our laboratory, we use a bod pod, and we also have access to dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, or DEXA for short. The bod pod is a little egg-shaped machine, and you just sit in it for about 2 minutes, and it's able to give us your percent body fat and fat-free mass, and it has been shown to be valid and reliable in an athletic population. The DEXA can also give us percent body fat, fat-free mass, and then it gives us bone mineral density, which is very important for athletes. DEXA is also considered a gold standard in body composition measurement, so it's a little bit more favorable compared to bod pod. So we measure all of these different metrics in our athletes to make sure that they're in the most optimal shape that they can be in, and we communicate this with their strength and conditioning coaches as well as the sports dietitian at Mason. So why should we monitor load? Why do we care about any of those different variables that I just talked about? Well, we wanted to check and see that the athletes are responding to the training stimulus in the way that we expect them to. So every athlete is going to be different, and they can respond very differently to your training stimulus. So we might expect our athletes to be maybe not so fatigued after a workout that we just put them through, but all of our load indicators are showing that the athletes actually are very fatigued. So we might need to dial back our training program a little bit, adjust things here or there, maybe throw in a recovery day. We also want to do this to understand individual responses to training. So like I just said, not every athlete is going to respond the same way to training stimulus. So we want to ensure that we are giving our athletes the best training program possible. So if that means taking stuff and individualizing it a little bit to make sure our athletes stay healthy and are ready to perform, we're able to do that by analyzing all of these values. We can also assess fatigue and the need for recovery. So again, if our athletes are feeling very fatigued, we don't want to overdo it with them, and we want to give them that recovery if need be. So whether that be just giving them an easier training day or completely giving them a day off, whatever we need to do to make sure our athletes are healthy is what we want to do. So we can use these values to assess for that as well. And we also use this to minimize the risk of becoming overtrained. So to where an athlete is now suffering from injuries, illness, feeling very fatigued, chronic pain, stuff like that. We want to try to avoid that as best we can, and load monitoring will allow us to do that. So how are we measuring these internal and external loads? So at Mason, we use a system called Catapult. Catapult is, you can see right here, these guys are wearing them on top of their shirts. And these are little GPS and accelerometer trackers that go in them. And that allows us to see how fast they're running. It gets our sprint count. It gets us our total distance covered. This will calculate the player load per minute, give us our repeated high intensity efforts, and it'll also give us that training impulse that we want to know. So that heart rate changes during a specific duration in time. There are other softwares that you can use that aren't Catapult. There's also Apex, I believe, is pretty popular. NBA teams use Catapult and Apex, as well as I know Premier soccer teams use them as well. I know other professional sports are definitely getting into this because this is really popular up and coming idea of athlete load monitoring. But I know for sure NBA uses it and Premier League uses them. So they use them in both training as well as a game setting. So these can be a little costly, but how can you incorporate load monitoring? So if you're a coach or if you're an athlete and you want to kind of know some of this stuff, how can you incorporate some of this? It might be a little bit difficult for you to do some biomarker tracking or even the body composition stuff. But we can still get heart rate variability. You can get your total distance covered. You could even just check out and see when you're accelerating and decelerating during things. And we can use like polar heart rate monitors. So for example, this one would go around your chest. You can use a Fitbit to monitor your heart rate. This can also give you heart rate variability. Same thing here with an Apple Watch. This is just a screenshot of what some workouts look like. So you can actually take this, download it, and look at it a little bit deeper. This is an Aura ring, so you literally just wear it on your finger and it can give you heart rate variability. It can give you acceleration. It can sense when you're exercising. And then a Whoop watch. And I know these Whoop watches are becoming more popular as well. And they are really good for monitoring sleep as well as heart rate variability. And they can tell you, it'll give you a score, like your readiness score for the day based on your sleep and your heart rate variability upon waking. So what do we do in the Patriot Performance Lab? Well, we are lucky enough that both our men's and women's basketball team are equipped with Catapult. So right now, our men and women's team use Catapult during their practices as well as their games, and it allows us to monitor load during both of those. Our basketball teams are also a part of regular body composition testing. So we do use both the Bod Pod and the DEXA to body composition test them. And they do 3 tests per year. So they do a preseason test, a postseason test, and they are on campus in the summer training, and they do a post-summer training body composition test as well. Right now, our women's basketball team is going through weekly neuromuscular fatigue monitoring. So they come to the lab and they do a counter movement jump on a jump mat, and we record those numbers and we can track them week by week to see how they're doing. Are they staying stagnant? Are they getting higher jumps, or are they getting lower jumps? Lower jumps would indicate the fatigue. And our women's team is also going through monthly salivary biomarker tests. So it's ideal if you want to track biomarkers throughout the entire course of the season, that you track them every 28 days or so. So that's what we're doing with them. So every 4 weeks they come in, they do a saliva test, and we're examining testosterone and cortisol levels in the women's basketball team. Other research that has come out of our lab, there was a study done a couple years ago monitoring men's soccer during the preseason. So traditionally preseason, the first 2 weeks, if you are an athlete or you are a coach, you might be nailing the athletes into the ground, trying to get them in good shape, kicking their butts when they first come back in. And what they did in this study was monitored external load, internal load, and biomarkers. And they found that external load, cortisol, sleep, and ratings of perceived exertion decreased from week 1 to week 2. So all those values were lower during the week 2. Testosterone, cortisol ratio, anger, depression, and vigor increased from week 1 to week 2. So all those values were greater in the second week than they were the first week of preseason. We found that morning cortisol levels positively predicted afternoon external load and post-training rating of perceived exertion. So what that means is the greater the cortisol levels were in the morning, the more likely they were going to have greater external loads in the afternoon training, as well as their post-season training or their post-training, ratings of perceived exertion. It was also found that testosterone and cortisol ratio negatively predicted afternoon external load and post-training RPE. So that just means if that ratio was low in the morning, then the external load and post-training RPE were likely high for the afternoon. And then morning heart rate variability negatively predicted post-training RPE. So the lower the heart rate variability, the greater the RPE was. And then if you wanted any more information on what we do in our laboratory, there are other PhD students in the lab other than me as well. You can check out the website, which is linked right there. My email address is mmagee2@gmu.edu. Dr. Margaret Jones, who is the director of the Patriot Performance Lab. Her email is right there, mjones15@gmu.edu, and you can follow us both on Twitter as well.